The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was a marvel of engineering, suspended within the heart of a vast space station orbiting a dying star. Its walls pulsed faintly with energy, formed from living metal that recorded every word spoken within its chambers. Here, the most powerful species in the galaxy convened to shape the fate of entire civilizations. Today, their attention was drawn to a newly discovered anomaly: humanity. A towering figure of crystalline light drifted to the center of the chamber. High Chancellor Varrock of the Tassari Dominion commanded immediate silence as he extended his elongated limbs, his voice reverberating through the hall like a chorus of deep chimes. "We gather to discuss the species known as humans, a race of insignificant, short-lived beings who have, against all logic, stepped beyond their homeworld and begun their crawl into the void." His statement was met with approving murmurs from several factions. Humanity was technologically primitive by galactic standards, lacking faster-than-light communications, true artificial intelligence, or any form of centralized governance beyond scattered alliances. By all accounts, they should have been inconsequential. Seated among the representatives, Envoy Kayla of the Seraphon Collective tilted her head, her wings twitching in agitation. Unlike the others, she had studied humanity's history, their conflicts, and their strange, paradoxical nature. She had read of their wars, pointless, brutal struggles fought amongst themselves. And yet, she had also read of their resilience, of the way they had clawed their way back from extinction time and time again. "They should not be dismissed so easily," Kayla said at last, her melodic voice carrying across the chamber. "Humans do not conquer like the Vorin, nor do they calculate like the Makari, but they do something far more dangerous. They persist." Across the chamber, Councillor Rask of the Vorin Dominion let out a low, guttural laugh. His scaled hands flexed, idly, his golden eyes gleaming with amusement. Persist? What a poetic way to describe a stubborn infestation. He leaned forward, sharp teeth flashing in the dim light. "They are not warriors. They are not builders of empires. They stumble through the stars, squabbling among themselves like primitive beasts." Kayla held his gaze, unflinching. "And yet they survive." A ripple of unease passed through some of the gathered council members. Even the oldest civilizations had histories of near extinction, but the humans had faced calamity after calamity, self-inflicted and otherwise, and had always emerged stronger. The idea of such creatures gaining access to advanced technology, of them learning to wield it against the greater galaxy, was unsettling. Councillor Thalric of the Sirvani Confederacy studied the exchange in silence before finally interjecting. "Your Dominion has already taken an interest in them, has it not?" His voice was calm, but the question carried weight. "Your warships have been seen patrolling the edges of their colonies." Rask's expression darkened, though he made no attempt to deny it. "A precaution," he admitted. "They will come to understand their place in the Grand Order. If they resist, well, their destruction will serve as an example to others." A heavy silence followed his words. The meaning was clear. The Vorin Dominion had already decided that humanity would not be allowed to grow unchecked. The council session ended without resolution. No agreements were made, no warnings were given. But even as the great powers of the galaxy debated humanity's fate, the first battles of an unexpected war were already unfolding. The Vorin Dominion's war machine moved like a shadow before the storm, silent and inevitable. Their fleets had subjugated dozens of worlds. Their warriors had crushed entire civilizations, and their empire stretched across the void like an unbroken tide. To the Vorin, humanity was nothing more than another primitive race standing in the path of expansion. Their mistake was in thinking that the war had already been won before the first shot was fired. The invasion began at the edge of human space, in the outer colonies that had barely begun to establish themselves. These settlements were small and scattered, filled with miners, engineers, and farmers, people who had left Earth to carve out a future among the stars. They had no grand fleets to protect them, no planetary defense grids to shield them. And yet, when the Dominion struck, the response was not what they had anticipated. The first world to fall was Carthage IV, a fledgling colony orbiting a red dwarf star. Vorin warships descended from the blackness like hunting beasts, their hulls adorned with the scars of 1,000 conquered worlds. They expected surrender. Instead, they found resistance. The colonists had no military presence, only cargo ships, drilling rigs, and a handful of outdated security drones. But humans had never relied on strength alone. They turned their mining lasers into makeshift weapons, detonated their own fuel, reserves to take down enemy landing craft, and sabotaged Dominion supply lines with guerrilla tactics that seemed to defy logic. A single colony was, of course, no match for the might of the Dominion. Carthage the Four fell within days. Its cities turned to smoldering ruins beneath the Voran advance. But when the Dominion sent out a transmission declaring their victory, something unexpected happened. The response was not fear. It was fury. Across human space, colonies that had once stood isolated now unified with a singular purpose. They abandoned their trade disputes and territorial squabbles, forging alliances with a speed that baffled the Dominion. Civilian ships were retrofitted into attack vessels, orbital stations were converted into weapons platforms, and private security forces became soldiers overnight. And then came the first true battle. When the Voran fleet moved toward Epsilon Prime, a strategic colony with a thriving shipyard, they expected an easy conquest. Their warships entered the system in perfect formation, prepared for another swift occupation. What they encountered instead was chaos, humanity's most powerful weapon. The battle was unlike anything the Voran had ever seen. Human pilots abandoned conventional tactics, executing erratic maneuvers that defied every known rule of engagement. Cargo haulers, seemingly unarmed, were rigged with explosives and used as makeshift torpedoes. Civilian ships acted as decoys, drawing fire away from human strike teams that attacked from impossible angles. Even after losing their stations and outnumbered 10-1, the humans refused to surrender. It was not strategy, it was defiance. For the first time in its long history, the Voran Dominion encountered an enemy that did not break. They crushed human ships, bombarded human worlds, and still, the resistance grew stronger. Instead of retreating, humanity adapted. Instead of falling apart, they united. The war that should have lasted days stretched into weeks, then months, and across the galaxy the impossible was unfolding. The humans were winning battles. From the shadows, the other great powers watched with growing unease. The question was no longer whether humanity would survive. It was whether the Dominion had just made a mistake that would change the course of history forever. The war that should have been a brief and decisive conquest had become something else entirely. Across the galactic networks, news of humanity's defiance spread like wildfire. The Voran Dominion's campaign, once assumed to be a mere formality, had stalled in the face of an enemy that refused to submit. The great empires and federations watched with growing unease, their councils filled with whispered debates. This was not how the balance of power was meant to work. The Dominion, for all its arrogance, was still one of the galaxy's most formidable forces. They had crushed civilizations far older than humanity. They had broken species with fleets that blotted out the stars. And yet, against this young, untested race, they struggled. What was worse, humanity was learning. With every battle, the humans adapted. Every Voran tactic that worked once failed the second time. Every weakness the Dominion exploited was reinforced with brutal efficiency. Human fleets, once haphazard collections of retrofitted civilian vessels, were now organized into strategic strike groups. Their weapons, once crude and improvised, had been reverse-engineered from captured Dominion technology. They weren't just fighting back. They were evolving. But for all their ingenuity, humanity was still alone. And alone, they could not win. That was about to change. Far from the battlefront, in the cold void between the stars, a meeting took place in the ruins of a forgotten world. A ship, unlike any designed by human hands, drifted in the darkness. Its hull was sleek, organic, its very shape a whisper of a species long believed to be irrelevant to the tides of war. Inside, a single figure waited. Zalari, of the shattered Zalari people. They had once been among the galaxy's oldest and most advanced species. The Zalari had built cities of glass and light, constructed machines that could sing stars to sleep. And yet, for all their advancements, they had lacked one thing: the will to fight. When the Voran Dominion had come for them, the Zalari had done as they always had. They had pleaded, they had reasoned, and when that failed, they had surrendered. The Dominion had stripped them of everything. Their homeworld was gone, their people scattered, their knowledge harvested and repurposed for war. The few who remained lived in exile, their once great civilization reduced to a whisper. But whispers, when carried by the right winds, could become storms. The Zalari had watched humanity fight. They had seen something in them. A fire, an unwillingness to bend, a defiance that the Zalari themselves had once possessed before it had been beaten out of them. And in that fire, they saw something dangerous. They saw hope. The human vessel that arrived was small, unassuming. Its hull bore the scars of battle, patches where Dominion weaponry had burned deep. The figure that stepped onto the Zalari ship was not a diplomat, nor a politician. He was a soldier. Not by birth, but by necessity. He had no grand speeches, no offers of wealth nor power. He did not beg for aid, he simply spoke. "The Voran took everything from you," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion but steady with purpose. "They think you're broken. They think you're finished. But I've seen your ships. I've seen your people. You're still here." Silence stretched between them. The Zalari delegate did not speak, but they listened. "You know what we are," the human continued. "You've seen how we fight. We don't stop. We don't forget. And neither should you." His eyes locked onto the alien's gaze. "You were a great people once, and you can be again." For the first time in generations, the Zalari felt something stir within them, a memory of who they had been. The first Zalari warships joined the human resistance within the month. At first, they were few, outcasts, exiles, those with nothing, left to lose. But soon, others followed. Those who had hidden, waiting for a reason to rise again. Those who had thought themselves powerless, only to realize that the fire still burned within them. The galaxy watched in shock as the impossible happened. Humanity had allies, and the war had only just begun. The galaxy had expected a swift and brutal subjugation of humanity, an inevitable conquest that would be recorded as a footnote in the annals of history. Instead, they found themselves bearing witness to something they had not seen in millennia, a war that was changing. The Voran Dominion, once so sure of their victory, now found themselves entangled in a campaign that refused to end. Their fleets, vast and disciplined, had been designed to crush resistance through overwhelming firepower and superior tactics. Their soldiers, hardened by centuries of conquest, had fought countless wars against enemies that played by the rules of war. But humans did not play by those rules, and now they weren't fighting alone. The Zalari, once a civilization known for art and philosophy, had been forced to learn the ways of war under humanity's guidance. At first, they struggled, hesitant, uncertain. The scars of their subjugation ran deep, but humanity did not see them as weak. They saw them as unfinished. "You think like prey," a human officer had once told a Zalari tactician. "You think about how to survive. That's why you lost." When the Zalari had bristled at the words, the human had only smiled grimly. "We don't think about how to survive. We think about how to win." That conversation would mark the beginning of something the Dominion had not anticipated. The Zalari, tempered by human aggression, began adopting strategies that defied conventional wisdom. They learned not just how to strike but when, not just how to evade, but how to lure. They studied humanity's chaotic tactics, their unorthodox use of inferior ships against superior forces. They learned how to turn the Dominion's discipline against them, how to exploit their overconfidence, their reliance on predictable formations, their belief that they had already won. And then, together, the humans and the Zalari did something no one had done before. They began hunting the Voran. No longer were human forces fighting from the defensive, desperately holding their colonies. Now, they were the aggressors, launching sudden, unpredictable strikes deep into Dominion-controlled space. They did not engage in full-scale battles. Such conflicts still favored the superior Dominion fleets. Instead, they bled them dry. Supply lines were shattered. Forward operating bases vanished overnight. Entire Dominion fleets arrived at pre-planned battle zones only to find empty space, their targets having already moved. only to be ambushed in asteroid fields they thought were clear, their ships torn apart by hidden mines and coordinated strikes. It was not war as the Dominion knew it. It was war as humanity knew it. On one Dominion-held world, factories that had once built weapons for the Empire were found burning to the ground, sabotaged not by enemy forces, but by slaves who had risen up, inspired by rumors of a human victory. The Zellari, once so accustomed to submission, led the revolt themselves. On the front lines, Dominion commanders began to fear every hyperspace jump, never knowing if a fleet would bring reinforcements or if it would disappear, falling into a human trap. Every encounter carried the weight of uncertainty, something the Dominion had never known before. And then came the most devastating blow. A Dominion warlord, Lord Commander Vashok, had been tasked with turning the war back in the Dominion's favor. He was a veteran, undefeated in countless campaigns. His flagship, the Black Fang, was said to be a vessel of legend, a symbol of Dominion might. It was found adrift, its engines dead, its command deck breached. When Dominion forces boarded the silent wreckage, they found no survivors, no bodies, only a single message scrawled onto the steel walls of the bridge, written in human standard. Your turn. The entire galaxy heard of it. The humans had not just fought back, they had struck fear into the heart of an empire that had never known fear. And for the first time since the war began, the Galactic Council convened not to discuss whether humanity could survive, but whether the Dominion could. For centuries, the Galactic Council had existed as a neutral force, a gathering of the most powerful species in the known galaxy. It was not a governing body. No single government could control the vast, chaotic expanse of interstellar civilizations. Instead, it was a place where empires brokered uneasy truces, where trade routes were secured, and where the delicate balance of power was maintained. But now, that balance had been shattered. The war between the Voran Dominion and humanity had started as a minor skirmish, an inevitable conquest. It had transformed into a prolonged conflict, and now it had become something worse, unpredictable. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never felt so divided. The chamber, an enormous structure carved into the heart of a hollowed-out moon, was alive with tension. Representatives of 100 species occupied their floating platforms, arranged in a vast circular formation around the central speaking floor. Some leaned forward in barely concealed excitement, others watched with wary expressions. A few, like the Makari technocracy, remained silent, their insectoid faces unreadable. In the center of it all, High Chancellor Varrock of the Tassari Dominion stood tall, his crystalline form pulsing with irritation. He slammed an elongated hand against the control panel before him, and a holographic projection materialized in the air above the chamber. It was a battlefield report. The image displayed the wreckage of a Dominion fleet. The debris field stretched across an entire sector, the remains of what had once been a mighty armada reduced to floating, lifeless husks. Among the shattered hulls, a single warship stood intact, a human vessel, broadcasting a simple transmission. On all known frequencies, Voran ships sighted, engaging. That was all. No demands, no threats, just a statement of fact, as if the destruction of an empire's fleet was a routine occurrence. Varrock's voice rang out, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of authority. This cannot continue. The humans were a minor species, an insignificant force. Now, they are an infection spreading across the galaxy. Their war has begun to alter the very structure of power. This council must act before they become something far worse than the Dominion ever was. A murmur spread through the chamber. Some nodded in agreement, others remained silent. Then, a voice cut through the tension. You speak of them as a disease. High Chancellor, I see something different. The speaker was Envoy Kayla of the Seraphon Collective. She was seated on her platform, her iridescent wings shifting slightly as she regarded Varrock with calm amusement. Varrock turned sharply. And what do you see, Envoy Kayla? I see a species that has done something no other has. Kayla gestured toward the projection, the flickering remains of Dominion warships. I see a species that has changed the course of history. You call them an infection. I call them an anomaly. Varrock's crystalline body flared with irritation. They are dangerous. Perhaps, Kayla said smoothly. But I wonder, to whom? A ripple of uncertainty spread through the council. For the first time, the question was not whether humanity was a threat, but to whom they posed the greatest danger. The Voran Dominion had believed themselves invincible. Now, they were bleeding. And the rest of the galaxy was watching. Then, another voice spoke, this time from the darkened section of the hall. They are not alone anymore. Councillor Thalric of the Servani Confederacy stepped forward, his silvered eyes gleaming in the dim light. Unlike the others, he had remained silent until now, observing, waiting. He gestured, and another holographic projection appeared. This one did not show a battlefield. It showed a fleet. Not a Dominion fleet, not a human fleet, but something new. The Zellari had not only joined the war, they had built something. It was a combined fleet, a force composed of human and Zellari warships moving in coordination. Their formations something neither species could have developed alone. It was an evolution, the first sign that the war was no longer just about humanity. It was becoming a movement. Thalric's voice was steady. This war is no longer about one species resisting conquest. It is about the order of the galaxy itself. The humans do not bow. They do not accept subjugation. And now, others have begun to follow them. Varroc's frustration was evident. And what would you propose, Councillor Thalric? That we support this chaos? Thalric tilted his head slightly. I propose that we recognize what is happening. The Dominion is not just losing a war, it is losing its grip on the galaxy. And whether we admit it or not, this council will soon face a choice. Silence fell over the chamber. The choice was unspoken, but it hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Would the Galactic Council move against humanity? Try to stamp out the fire before it spread further? Or would they do the unthinkable? Would they stand with them? The meeting ended without a resolution. No votes were cast. No decisions were made. But as the councillors left, the weight of history pressed down upon them. Across the stars, the war raged on. The Dominion, once so sure of its dominance, was now fighting for survival, and humanity, against all odds, was no longer alone. The Voran Dominion had never known fear. From the moment their species had taken to the stars, they had been conquerors, expanding without pause, absorbing or annihilating any civilization that stood in their path. Their empire had been built on discipline, on military precision, on the unwavering belief that their rule was inevitable. But now, inevitability was slipping through their fingers. It began as whispers. Quiet concerns spoken in the shadows of the Dominion's war councils. Reports of fleets disappearing. Supply lines failing. Outposts going silent without so much as a distress signal. At first, the High Command dismissed them. Human tactics were erratic, unpredictable, but ultimately insignificant. The war was under control. Then came the first defection. On the Dominion world of Ivaris Prime, a garrison of Voran soldiers found themselves stranded. Their supply ships had been intercepted. Their communication lines were cut. They were not surrounded. There were no human fleets in orbit, no armies at their gates. And yet, the planet became their prison. Without resupply, their food reserves dwindled. Their weapons grew useless without energy cells. Every attempt to send for reinforcements failed, their transmissions jammed by an unseen force. For weeks, they waited, proud warriors of the Dominion, refusing to yield. Then came the broadcasts. Human voices, Zellari voices. We have no interest in slaughter, the message said. The Dominion abandoned you. We offer an alternative. It was not a call to surrender. It was an invitation. Some resisted. Some held to their loyalty, to their belief that the Dominion would come for them. But others listened. When the first Voran officers abandoned their posts and swore allegiance to the enemy, the shockwave rippled through the entire Dominion. A force that had once been unshakable was now showing cracks. The defectors did not flee, in shame. They stood before the cameras of the galactic networks, their former commanders watching in horror as they declared their oaths to a new cause. Not to humanity, not even to the Zellari, but to something greater. To freedom. It was an idea the Dominion had spent centuries crushing beneath its boots. And yet, here it was, rising again, spreading like wildfire through their own ranks. The High Command's response was swift and brutal. Loyalist forces executed officers suspected of treason. They purged entire battalions, destroying their own, to ensure obedience. But fear, once introduced into the heart of an empire, does not easily die. Loyalists turned on each other, paranoia gripping entire fleets. Admirals who once commanded with absolute authority now saw assassins in every shadow. Soldiers who had spent their lives fighting for the Dominion began to ask the question that should have never entered their minds. Why? Why were they fighting? An enemy that refused to kneel? Why were they dying for an empire that left them behind? Why did the humans, the so-called inferior species, stand together while the Dominion tore itself apart? The first true mutiny came aboard the Iron Vow, a Dominion dreadnought stationed near the frontier. The crew, weary and starving, seized control of the ship from their commanding officers and defected to the resistance. It was unthinkable. A Dominion warship, one of their greatest symbols of power, now bearing a human banner. And then came the coup. Deep within the Dominion's core systems, a faction of high-ranking officials, fearing the Empire's imminent collapse, turned against their own leaders. They sought peace, not out of mercy, but out of desperation. They knew that if the war continued, the Dominion itself would cease to exist. For the first time in history, the ruling council of the Dominion was divided. One faction, led by Supreme Warlord Tarkath, demanded total war, the annihilation of humanity, at any cost. They spoke of honor, of vengeance, of restoring the Dominion's lost glory. The other, led by Councillor Valus, saw the truth, that the old ways had failed, that the Dominion's survival depended not on conquest, but on change. But there was no room for both visions, and so the Dominion turned on itself. Entire fleets broke apart, some remaining loyal to the war effort, others abandoning their posts. Civil conflicts erupted on Dominion-held worlds, as governors and military leaders chose sides. What had once been a singular, unbreakable force was now splintering into warring factions. And humanity? Humanity watched. They did not rush to strike the killing blow. They did not need to. The Dominion was dismantling itself. It had begun as a war for survival. It had become a war for revolution. And now, as the Dominion crumbled from within, the galaxy itself stood at a crossroads. Would the old order fall with the Dominion, or would something new rise from the ashes? The war had not ended in a single decisive battle. There was no grand surrender, no moment where the Dominion fell to its knees and begged for mercy. Wars like this did not end with fanfare. They ended with exhaustion, with whispers instead of gunfire. And yet, the galaxy felt the weight of history shift. The Voran Dominion, once a symbol of absolute power, was now a fractured empire teetering on the edge of collapse. Entire fleets had abandoned their posts, governors declared independence, and factions within the Dominion fought one another for control. Some clung desperately to the old ways, still waging war in forgotten corners of space. Others sought peace, if only to salvage what little remained. The once proud core worlds of the Dominion, where towering spires had reached toward the sky in arrogant defiance, now burned. Civil unrest had boiled over into outright rebellion. Planets that had been subjugated for centuries rose against their former masters, not just because of their suffering, but because they had seen something they had never imagined possible. Power greater than the Dominion itself, not a power of weapons, not a power of fleets, a power of defiance. And at the center of it all stood humanity. They were not conquerors. They did not seek to replace the Dominion with an empire of their own. But they had done something no other species had. They had forced the galaxy to change. On a quiet, unremarkable moon in neutral space, representatives from across the galaxy gathered. The war had not yet officially ended, but the battles had grown fewer, the fighting more desperate. Everyone knew what was coming. The Dominion was no longer an empire. It was a question waiting for an answer. Humanity had been invited to this meeting, not as vassals, not as subjects, but as equals. For the first time in recorded history, a species that had once been dismissed as primitive now stood before the greatest powers of the galaxy. not as a conquered people, but as victors. The human delegation was small. There were no elaborate uniforms, no gilded banners. They did not sit on raised platforms like the elder races. They sat at the same table as the Zalari, as the Tassari, as the Servani Confederacy, and even, unexpectedly, as the splinter factions of the Dominion. The question hung over them all. What now? It was a Dominion warlord, one of the few who had chosen negotiation over annihilation, who spoke first. His voice was slow, measured. You had no fleets when this war began. No allies. You had nothing, and yet here you sit, shaping the future of the galaxy. The human diplomat, a woman who had once been a military officer before war had turned her into something else, met his gaze. Her expression was unreadable. We had ourselves, she said simply. The warlord studied her, his alien eyes narrowing. Then he let out a slow exhale. And what do you want? He asked. Humanity had fought a war for survival. They had outmaneuvered a galactic empire, turned enemies into allies, and forced an entire civilization to reckon with its own fragility. And yet, as the galaxy leaned in to hear their answer, they did not demand tribute. They did not claim the Dominion's throne. We want what you never offered us, the diplomat said. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. Choice. Silence followed. Not the silence of fear. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of realization. The war had never been about conquest. It had never been about expanding borders or taking control of the Dominion's worlds. It had been about something bigger. Something that empires had long feared and long ignored. The right to choose one's own fate. The war had forced the galaxy to see that power did not come from ancient bloodlines or the size of one's fleet. It came from will, from the refusal to kneel. And now, for the first time in its long and violent history, the galaxy had to decide whether it would cling to the old ways or step into something new. Months later, long after the negotiations had begun, a lone starship drifted silently in deep space. It was an old vessel, a human ship patched together from a dozen different sources, its hull still bearing the scars of war. On its bridge, a pilot watched as a new transmission played across the galactic network. The Dominion had officially fractured. What remained of its leadership had agreed to a ceasefire. Some factions would surrender, others would become something else. But the war, for all intents and purposes, was over. A new coalition was forming, something that had never existed before. A union of independent species, some once enslaved, others once enemies, now standing together. It was not an empire. It was not a council. It was something new, and at its heart was humanity. Not ruling, not demanding, but guiding. The pilot leaned back in their seat, exhaling slowly. The war had changed everything. The galaxy would never be the same again. And humanity? Humanity had found its place. Not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as the ones who had shown the galaxy that empires could fall, that defiance could shape destiny, that sometimes the smallest embers could start the greatest fires, and those fires would never go out.